Maria, will you please call the roll?
Yes. Dan Bernal.
Present.
Anne-Marie Dulege.
Present.
Isabel Dudon.
Here.
Mark Fisher Colbury.
Here.
Elena Flowers. David Higgins.
Here.
Steve Julesgaard.
Present.
Dave Martin.
Here.
Christine Miaskowski. Lauren Miller-Rogan.
Here.
Adriana Padilla. Joe Panetta.
Here.
Al Roulette.
Here.
Oz Stewart.
Here.
Jonathan Thomas.
Here.
Mark Torres.
Here.
Carol Watson.
Here.
Dan Winokur. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. We're going to move into the action items here. First and only is consideration of applications submitted in response to clinical trial stage projects program announcements, SINs 1, 2, and 3. There are 2 applications to be considered here. Oz, as chair of the Application Review Subcommittee, is going to run the first, but as he is conflicted, I will run the second. And so without further ado, let me turn the meeting over to Oz. Thank you, Oz.
Thank you. So welcome, everybody. I am going to actually log on with my phone because I have a sort of a weak internet connection here. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. You guys are freezing, so that bothers me. So I think that we need to start with a presentation from Gil. Is that correct, yeah. Maria?
That is correct.
So Gil.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Oz. I'm going to share my presentation. Okay. Hopefully all of you can see this. So good morning to all. And so today, I want to give you an overview of the recommendations from the Grants Working Group, as mentioned, for our clinical program. Just as a reminder, our clinical program encompasses 3 different program announcements. The 2 applications that we are considering today are both clinical trial applications. We issued the program announcements in January 1st under Prop 14 as the beginning and relaunch of our core programs. And so our first deadline was at the end of January. And so this is the first cycle that we are then showing you the outcomes and recommendations from the Grants Working Group on those. And we set, and the board set an allocation of $100 million for the period of January through June of 2021. The amount requested today by both applications would total to $14.4 million. And so if those are approved, we would have an unused balance of $85.6 million remaining under that allocation. And so a reminder just of the criteria that are used by the Grants Working Group in assessing the merit of these applications. We, in the past, had 4 key questions, which we now have 5, and I'll go over these, especially the 5th one, in more detail. The first one is whether the project holds the necessary significance and potential for impact, meaning what value does it offer, and is it something worth doing? Does it have a sound rationale? Is the project well planned and designed? Is the project feasible, including do they have an appropriate and qualified team, the infrastructure and resources to carry out what they propose to do? And then the new and 5th criterion, which was added in this cycle and going forward, is does the project address the needs of underserved communities? So using these criteria, the Grants Working Group then assigned a scientific score to these applications using a system of 1, 2, or 3. Giving it a score of 1 means that this is an exceptional application. It could have some minor recommendations and adjustments that wouldn't require further GWG review. A score of 2 means it needs improvement. And so typically these applications go back to the applicant to address the concerns of the reviewers, and they resubmit so that they can be reevaluated. And then of course a score of 3 such that it is sufficiently flawed and wouldn't warrant funding at this time. So when beginning our review cycles this year, there were some new elements that we introduced into the applications. And so we presented these new elements to the grants working group as part of our instructions. So among them were the increase in scope, just so that they were aware that gene therapy is now part of what CIRM can fund, the inclusion of a data sharing plan, which is part of the application and something that can and should be evaluated, addressing the needs of underserved communities, and the addition of this as a review criterion. Although we already had this section and have actually been addressing it for quite a while, the review criterion itself is new. And then lastly, a section on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I want to just spend a little time on these last 2 new elements. The first one of addressing the needs of the underserved communities and just distinguishing it from the diversity, equity, and inclusion sections, because there is certainly sometimes confusion about these 2. So the first section on addressing the needs of underserved communities is a section that describes the applicant's plan for outreach and enrollment of a diverse patient cohort that accounts for racial, ethnic, and gender diversity in the clinical trial. And so this is a component that has existed in the applications for quite a while, and I'll explain that further. And that is evaluated as part of the overall project and incorporated into the scientific merit score of the 1, 2, or 3. Separately, we added a section on diversity, equity, inclusion in research. And so this section describes how the applicant team would incorporate perspectives and experiences to improve the project through the composition of the team or any other approaches that the applicant would present. And this section is evaluated and scored by patient advocate members and is represented by the DEI score, which is on a scale of 0 to 10. Now, this section is not only new, it is still under development. And so it is a section that we would advise, and I'll go into it in a little more detail, that we consider it sort of a test run in terms of how it is used in making a final funding decision on any of these applications. So let me just go and address the needs of the underserved first. So when it comes to clinical trials, all projects that are funded through state funds or even through federal funds, there are existing laws that require that women and minorities be included in clinical studies. And so this has been the case even since CIRM's original founding. And so this is part of our regulations. And so this section really draws out what the plans by the applicant would be in order to address this. And so given its importance, we created that new 5th review criterion in order to incorporate it into the scoring of the clinical trial application. And so the instructions to the applicant, basically, just to summarize, are for them to present their plan for outreach and study participation by underserved and disproportionately affected populations, to present any justification for the exclusion of any groups that are at risk for the disease, and basically have an overall presentation of what they intend to do, and noting that the grants working group and governing board will evaluate those plans. The 5th review criterion then lays out these sub-questions of whether the proposal adequately addresses all of this. Does the proposal provide a clear and robust plan for outreach and study participation? Does the proposal address the planned distribution of subjects according to race, sex, gender, and ethnicity? And do they have an appropriate rationale for the study population that they are addressing? And if there is any group that is excluded, whether there is adequate justification. So this is what the grants working group guidance is and provides on that section. Now, distinct from that is a very separate section on the diversity, equity, and inclusion, as I mentioned before, which is the new element to be evaluated by patient advocate members. This is intended to be a more holistic view of diversity and inclusion in the composition of the research team and other approaches. And so the instructions to the applicant are still a little bit vague. So I think this is certainly where we need to develop our guidance, both to the applicants as well as to reviewers in terms of what is expected and what to do here. But currently the application instructions say, describe how the research team has or will incorporate diverse and inclusive perspectives and experience in the implementation of the research project, including, for example, inclusion of team members from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And so one of the elements that makes this section also challenging for the grants working group to assess is this warning that we presented to them that by state law, CIRM is prohibited from taking race, ethnicity, national origin, or gender into account in making grant decisions, meaning that as they discuss and evaluate this particular section, it cannot be solely based on or make sole reference to these elements. And so therefore, the evaluations need to be focused on other factors such as socioeconomic status or those that are first in their family to attend college. So the scoring, again, on that DEI section by patient advocate members was at least in this initial run done on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the best possible scores. We collected comments in order to provide justification for those scores. And as mentioned before, this process is new, so we're anticipating that improvements are going to be made as we go along. And we're using the feedback from our patient advocate members, as well as our applicants who are, putting in and requesting guidance on those sections. So expect to see more on this as we develop it. Another important note regarding this particular review is that the two applications that are being considered are resubmitted applications. So they originally applied in August of 2020 under Prop 71 funding and received a score of 2. And so with a score of 2, meaning that they get the opportunity to revise and resubmit, unfortunately, we were at a point where there was no CIRM funding available for them to do that. And that wouldn't occur until we reestablish funding under Prop 14. So with the issuing of this new core set of program announcements, the applicants resubmitted. And so we are seeing them now as revised applications. But also it's important to note that the new elements of data sharing and DEI were not components of the original application nor of the original review. But the applicants did submit supplementary information that addressed those areas and were then looked at by the grants working group in the most recent review. Okay, so before I go into then each of the applications, are there questions about the background and the process? Or Oz, do you want to say anything at this point?
Sorry, I have to go to my phone because the internet is really unstable on my office computer here. So just to emphasize what Gil said about the DEI, this was something that actually we had a lot of discussion about. And I think that what Gil said about it being a sort of trial run is very important here. We really realize that there's a lot of sort of moving parts to this and need to get it really better explained to both the applicants and the review group. So I'll just emphasize that. And also just to say that both of these applicants, and Gil, maybe you could correct me, but so they came in under the earlier RFP. It actually didn't have a section 5 in their revised application, but they were asked to provide information regarding that. So it's a little bit different than we'll see going forward. And just to sort of emphasize that for everybody before we actually start the consideration. Thank you. And but please, anybody ask any questions now before we actually get into the applications themselves.
Yes, Dr. Stewart, it's Art. I just wanted to remind ourselves that perhaps we should reach out to General Counsel for UC, because on the Board of Regents, we've been dealing with this issue, obviously, once Prop 16 did not pass, and how we apply this to admission standards and a whole lot of other employment issues, because it's very relevant to what we're discussing here. So I will try and get a legal counsel's opinion from UC so that we're in sync with our institutions.
Thank you. That's I think an excellent way to move forward on this. Thank you, Art. I see a hand.
Adriana has her hand raised.
Yeah, I see that. Yes, Adriana.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I just wanted to know if they're gonna, what have you worked out, Gil, the process of how the criteria are going to be developed over time on the DEI status? You know, because we talk about diversity, but I was also interested in how that pertains to inclusion and equity for instance, underserved communities in California, and how these research studies would address that particularly.
Right. So that's a great question, and I think that's part of what we need to, think through more carefully and be able to develop, the expectations for these types of projects. We're also trying to implement this across the different types of projects that we fund. So also in discovery and translation. And so what the expectation for DEI would be across all of those different types of projects would likely differ as well. And so I think the development of it is going to require us just to have more conversations, particularly with grants working group patient advocate members in order to more fully develop it.
So is that like a work group that's already in process, or what is the timeline for that?
So we don't yet have a timeline for it, but we've begun discussions with grants working group patient advocate members, and so that is something that is ongoing, and we will have to develop.
Okay, so we'll get some information on that down the road.
Yes, absolutely.
Great. Thank
you. And this is Oz again. If I could just emphasize something that Gil said, because it's really important. The what you're actually asking about in terms of outreach is covered under Section 5 currently, and is something that we have been doing for quite a while. And as Gil said, actually is incorporated into both state and federal laws as well. So from that point of view, that's one aspect of this that is already in place very firmly. And then the separate DEI consideration, which really relates primarily to the team, is the one I think that is going to be the one that is going forward, going to need more work. Am I stating that correctly, Gil? Is that?
Yes, that's right, Oz. That's correct.
Thank you. Hope that clarifies. Let's see, we have a hand from Isabel.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I'm glad that Art is going to check in with the lawyers, because the very nature of the by state law CIRM is prohibited says one thing, and that really ties hands because and I'm glad we're looking at composition of research groups. One, this is a way by bringing in investigators of color, racial and ethnic groups, we're improving the pipeline. We're helping an underserved community have these experts. But beyond that, it strikes me that they bring with them not only lived experience, but culture and language that is additional value to the research team, and without it might not be able to do the recruitment necessary, the outreach necessary that is already creating the trustworthiness with those communities with whom they wish to engage. So I have a little problem when you're discounting someone's race or ethnicity. And I'm hoping that we get the nuance clarity on that, because that sounds just strictly prohibited. You can't even think about that. And I think there must be a nuance to that interpretation, because in fact, if we don't have people who have bring their race and ethnicity to the table, then it's the same old, same old. Thank you.
I think I have a hand from Al Rolette.
Thank you. I don't want to repeat everything that Oz said. My perspective around this, and certainly for my colleagues on the board, the commitment that we've made as evaluators is to provide staff with information that will result in the kind of process improvements that we all want and that are consistent with the legislation, specifically as it relates to the inclusion of people with lived experience, i.e. either on as part of a group that is leading applications, or certainly making sure that it is reflected in the application, and that the perspective of people with lived experience is not only important, but from my perspective, essential. Again, taking into consideration the social determinants of health, and again, that perspective, and making sure that it's reflected in the responses that we get. And then I think I want to assert that Gil is right on when he said that the inclusion of the reviewers is resulting in us asking applicants better questions. And that as we ask better questions, we're going to get better, more comprehensive responses that are not reflective of the kind of work that typically excludes people of color, but is more inclusive of people of color, underserved and unserved communities.
Good, thank you. I don't see any more hands. Maria, oops, wait, Steve Julesgaard.
Yes, so I'm not sure how many people are as versed in the new Proposition 14 these days, particularly with regard to something called the Treatments and Cures Accessibility and Affordability Working Group. But there are two particular sections in what that group is supposed to be aimed at that I'm just going to read to you because they address something that Adriana mentioned earlier. The first is that this group is to recommend to the governing board, that's us, policies and programs to help Californians obtain access to human clinical trials and to make treatments and cures arising from institute-funded research available to California patients throughout California. The second provision reads as follows. They're also to recommend to us, the governing board, policies and programs to help Californians afford to participate in human clinical trials and to make treatments and cures arising from institute-funded research affordable to California patients regardless of financial means. So we have a group, I take it, that's still being formed, but their goal is to advise us of policies that we might adopt that would reach out to underserved communities and also potentially help pay people in those underserved communities in association with being in clinical trials. So we have help coming, I hope.
Yes, you do, Steve, as a chair of that new working group. And you're right, we haven't finished naming all of the participants that are articulated in the language that Bob and I wrote for Prop 14 on that very issue. And we're starting to do that. But I've also been working on it as well in preparation for our first meeting, when we can at least begin to outline the general outlines of what's going on. I took particular steps in bringing Covered California negotiators to CIRM early on, about a year ago, to begin discussions on affordability issues and how to reach out to third-party payers. We also have a good formula that we've been working with since 1996 at the Organ Transplant Foundation, One Legacy, of which I'm the vice chair, which speaks directly to what you just said, and that is, how do we establish criteria so that we can help caregivers and their patients come to a location which is far from their home and still be able to pay for their minimum of expenses. So I'll get much more into detail as we evolve and the first meeting is held, hopefully soon. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
You're welcome, Mark. Just one follow-up to that. So it seems to me that the language that's written here in what's desired is broad enough to allow CIRM itself to establish funding mechanisms from CIRM funds to assist in providing access to underserved communities.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Steve. The way we handle it with One Legacy is that we create specific foundations that we fund. For example, we have the AVA Foundation, which is directly linked to heart transplant patients, and we fund them by about $100,000 a year, and they raise a lot of their own money, and that directly assists heart patient transplant patients and their caregivers. We're more fortunate in that we have the funding and will have the funding available to help at least begin the first steps of that financing for stem cell patients and their caregivers and their costs.
Great, thanks.
Good. Any other questions or comments? I want to make sure that we have a robust discussion about this. And thanks for everybody providing their input here. Anything else? I don't see any hands. Maria, do you see any hands that I'm missing?
No, I do not.
Okay, great. So we can, I think, go ahead and move to consideration of the first application. Gil, if I can turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Oz. So the first application to be considered is 12153. So this is a CAR T-cell therapy for pediatric brain tumors. This is an autologous therapy of a chimeric antigen receptor T-cell cell therapy, and it is engineered to target an antigen on pediatric malignant brain tumors. The indication is for recurrent or refractory malignant pediatric brain tumors that express that tumor-associated antigen. The goal of this particular study is to complete a phase 1 trial. The funds requested is $8.4 million for this study. Just to provide some background information, brain tumors are the leading cause of solid tumor cancer death in children between the ages of 0 and 14, and it is the second most common cancer in children after leukemia. And the prognosis for pediatric patients that have aggressive brain tumors is very poor and often is just a few months. The proposed therapy would offer the possibility of improved patient outcomes that could include tumor shrinkage and regression. And the approach would provide a therapeutic option with improved tolerability and fewer side effects than the current standard of care, which is mostly radiation therapy and in some cases neurosurgical resection. Why is this a stem cell project? The therapeutic candidate contains memory T cells. In looking at our portfolio projects of projects we have funded that might be related or similar to this, on this table is listed the current application and then 2 other projects. So there is another phase 1 clinical trial focused on malignant glioma, in this case in adults. It is by the same team and it's using the same candidate in adult patients. So largely a similar study, but a different patient population. There is another somewhat related study that we are funding, is also a phase 1 clinical trial, but that one is focused on using a similar T-cell therapy approach, but it is for brain metastases from HER2 positive breast cancer cells. The applicant, as mentioned, has received previous CIRM funding, and so listed here are 2 previous projects. The other one is the phase 1 clinical trial that we just mentioned that has progressed quite well and achieved all milestones on time, and they are on track for completing their last milestone by November 2021, when they would wrap up that project. They also received a translational award in the past that helped develop this overall therapeutic candidate. So the recommendation from the grants working group was a score of 1, with 11 members of the working group giving it a score of 1. There were 4 members that gave it a score of 2, and no members that gave it a score of 3. This had a DEI score of 9. CIRM's team recommendation is to fund this application, concurring with the grants working group recommendation, for an award amount of $8.4 million. And so I will pause there.
Gil, may I ask a question, please? This is David in San Diego.
Absolutely.
What DEI score would independently kill this application if it were low? Like what if the DEI score was 1 and all the other scores were as presented? What would that do to the process?
Well, I think that is up to the Application Review Subcommittee. So, you know, what we do is present the recommendations and the scores as were designated by the group. But ultimately, I think that becomes part of the programmatic review that happens here in terms of what weight you wish to give it relative to the overall scientific merit of the application.
But it's not going to be formulaic. It's going to be on an individual basis.
That's right.
Okay.
Gil, could I just jump in there quickly? David, I think that's your question is one of the very reasons that we view the current DI scores as a test run, because we need to develop more and more clear criteria, both for the evaluation and for the presentation of information by the applicants themselves. And because the process is evolving and we have not yet achieved that level of clarity, we're at this stage not considering the DEI scores as part of your decision making. They're there for information purposes only while we continue to refine the process.
Thank you, James. That's, as usual, you're very clear. But my question sort of has to do not with how we're going to arrive at a score that we are happy with, but what are we going to do with that score? So we've got, it's essentially the slide in front of us, we've got 2 scores. We've got a 1 and a 9, say. So are they equal weight, or does the 9 in DEI, since it's, what is it, 1/5 of the total score? I mean, is there some way it automatically gets averaged in, or is this something going to be done on a case by case basis? So this time I think the DEI score is really important, and the next application I don't think it's as important. Does that make sense? That question makes sense?
It
I
does.
think it makes great sense. Thank you. Yes.
And I think those are the types of questions that we will be evaluating
okay.
as we consider how to move forward in utilizing both applying the DEI criteria, the scoring methodology. What's the difference between a 6 and a 9, for example?
Right.
And then what the group's thoughts are with respect to how those scores are then utilized in the ultimate funding decisions.
Okay. James, I'm absolutely satisfied. That's a perfect answer. Thank you.
Isabel here.
Yes, Isabel, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Us. I'm glad that David raised the question, because I have that same kind of curiosity, both when it comes to the DEI, but also when it comes to the inclusion plan. So let's say the inclusion plan shows that they're really scoring. I hope that's not me making all the squeaks. The inclusion plan shows that they've got a very robust engagement plan, and that they've looked at, so sorry about that. So they've looked at you look at the inclusion plan, it's very robust. It takes into account the impact of these brain cancers on children of color, who oftentimes don't end up in the best of treatment and care circumstances and don't have access to the highest quality kinds of scientific diagnosis and assessment. So if that is high in terms of its score, then I might have less concern that the DEI score is not as much inclusive of a large group of investigators from these communities, so that there provides some balance. But if both are low, then I would have a great deal of concern that one of the major reasons for considering inclusion is not being promoted, simply because history shows us that unless we're in front of you, you're not necessarily thinking about us. And therefore, this is why we keep asking for inclusion and plans that are very specific and have outcomes as a result of those plans, that makes folks have to do something as opposed to we'll consider it. And that includes, for me, the review team, who will say, well, that's good, we'll think about it, instead of it being required as one of the scientific scores. Very high, not just, I just at this point in time, I've seen enough research applications where they check a box and then they don't live up to the expectation that they do much beyond the checking the box. And so I'm wanting us to hold people's feet to the fire at every level, be it the DEI score or be it at the inclusion plan, that there are, in fact, you'll lose points if you don't have a strong plan, period. What do they say? No stop here. Sorry, Osmia, you can help with that one. But this is where I think we need to be now. And given the nuances we talked about, that Art's going to look into about it can't be just on race, et cetera, in terms of this. I still think we need to get as close to that edge as we can with how much we can make people respond. Thanks.
Thank you, Isabel. I just want to remind everybody of what Gil said in the beginning, and that is that the issue of inclusion in the clinical activities and all aspects of the proposal itself is actually criterion 5. That is part of the scored criteria. It's not scored separately. That's actually important. So the DEI score is separate from that, although you might consider this, it is obviously a criterion relating to inclusion, but it is part of the application. It's scored. It is factored into the overall score of the application by the grants working group, which of course includes patient advocates on it. So again, the DEI that we're sort of talking about here, that separate score relates to the other issue. Thank you. Just to say again what Gil said, but I just want to make it really crystal clear to everybody as we're looking at everything going forward. Thank you. Any other questions, comments?
This is Dave Martin. I am having difficulty. It may be my computer, but certainly things are getting frozen, including the audio. But my question are technical questions that are related. The first is, can you share what the target is here for this CAR-T? And then the second is, what else is going on against that target with our autologous CAR-Ts for pediatric brain tumors?
Certainly. So the target is IL-13 receptor alpha 2. And so this is the same target that the previous trial in adult patients that is ongoing is is also designed to target. The other elements that this trial is trying to assess is the effect of lymphodepletion in the patients as a mechanism of increasing the effectiveness of the CAR T therapy, as well as doing a intracranial ventricular administration of the CAR T cell therapy and testing that in the patient. So those two additional elements are a component of this trial that I think makes it unique among other trials that are also targeting malignant brain tumors.
And is the target the same, the molecular target, the same as what's in the field?
The molecular target is not necessarily the same. It has been studied in other trials, but there are trials that are testing other molecular targets as well.
Thank you. I'll make one other comment. And being in this business, I'm very cognizant of the cost of phase ones. This is quite high compared to what I'm aware of for autologous phase one studies.
But along those lines, how many healthy patients, actually in that case, would that include?
You know, that's a good question. I don't have the answer right in front of me, but I can find it very quickly for you.
Because the cost is not solely related to the number of subjects, but it is largely influenced by that number.
Sure.
And also, can we know, or maybe does it matter or not, whether this application comes from an academic center versus a biopharma company? And I assume that we cannot know that, and that it should not influence our assessment of the scientific merit of the proposal. Is that right?
So yes, it shouldn't influence your assessment of the proposal, but I think it is important to know that there is a distinction in terms of an academic entity applying, because there are the indirect and facilities costs that are greater, so that influences the total amount that is often requested. So in this case, being an academic institution, some of the costs, or a significant amount of the cost, are related to that as well, and not all direct costs that are going to the trial per se.
Thank you. Very clear.
And some examples, as I understand it or recall, the academic institutions have waived or significantly reduced the indirect costs that are imposed.
So it's rare for an academic institution to waive the indirect costs, but certainly for companies, many do and choose to do that, but also they are limited to only 35% total facilities costs. So they generally cannot claim as much as an academic institution would.
But Jill, Gil, the reason why I was calling is not so much about indirect cost, but just to better understand if the entity proposing this effort that hopefully we're about to fund has other financial leverages. Yes, you're right, there's indirect costs with an academic institution, but a biopharma company would have to pay a hefty price to a CRO to do the job. And that comes again, a CRO or other actually academic institution to enroll volunteers. Here comes again indirect cost. So my thoughts were more, I think a biopharma, if it were to do it, and I understand it's not the case, would have more leverage to get sources from other funding, particularly angel investors. But I think here I'm getting beyond the point of scientific merit. And that's where the number of subjects would influence potentially our assessment of the value of the cost versus the outcome.
Thank you. I actually, I do agree perhaps that we're getting into territory that's beyond
Yeah.
consideration of scientific merit. Not that it shouldn't be considered, but I'm not sure quite what level of discussion we should have about it. I see a hand from Steve Julesgaard here. Thank you. Steve?
Yes, so quite some time ago, years ago, this whole issue of, you know, the amount of money that's being asked for, does it line up with what the work to be done is? And so we instituted a budget review process, or at least at that time we did, where the program was ab initio to be shipped off to somebody who was familiar with costs associated with doing trials. And they were to give us, you know, a thumbs up or thumbs down as to whether or not they thought that the costs that were being, the amount of money that was being asked for was appropriate for the scope of work. So I don't know whether we still do that or not. And I guess that's really my question.
So
Thank you. Yes, Gil, please.
Yeah, so we don't do that. We're doing it in-house. So what we assess is generally whether the costs are allowable, whether they are comparable to what we observe in real costs from other awards that we've issued. So based on data that we have, we make those comparisons, but we have not actually for quite a while presented it to another entity to do a budget review, as I think we had originally intended several years ago.
Thank you, Gil. And if I could just make an amendment to my statement. When I was talking about getting into territory that perhaps is beyond scientific merit, that referred to considerations of indirect cost. And, you know, that's where we actually have defined values, if you want, or it's all sort of formulaic. The issue of cost of the research program itself is a separate issue that at least in my opinion, is a topic for discussion here. But I just wanted to separate those two. One is really more totally contractual, defined by law, actually. And the other is something that, how much does research actually cost and how much are they asking for it? Thank you. Other questions or comments?
So indeed, Oz, I really appreciate that you're making this distinction, which we should all make. But my question to Gil and to the CIRM is that if we're voting for scientific merit, that we get it. But in addition to that, was there or will there be the review that Stephen alluded to, which is the financial consideration? Are they asking too much for what they intend to do? And how would that influence ultimately them receiving the grant?
So we do a budget assessment, again, that is peripheral at the beginning, that is done in-house to just assess whether they have the appropriate generalized budget. But we do a more detailed budget review after an award is approved. And so oftentimes there will be costs that are removed either because they're not allowable or found to be excessive. And so, you know, in terms of determining whether a cost is excessive, that can come from the grants working group. So either we get commentary from grants working group reviewers that suggest that we look at specific items or costs, or in our comparison to other awards that we've issued. Now, the other important thing to note is that the amount that is approved is basically the maximum amount that can be issued to that awardee or grantee. And so the real costs are monitored over time because we have an ongoing assessment and progress of the project. So in many cases, the total award amount that's approved is not necessarily spent, just given the oversight over the period of the award. And then also just I want to add that you were asking for the number of patients in this study, which is 22 for this particular one.
Thank you. Very clear. Very
Gil,
helpful.
can I jump in really quick? Just want to add, so we do, as Gil mentioned, a benchmarking of the internal portfolio. And so we did an analysis of similar projects in CAR-T that are autologous. And this came in that the cost per patient ranked amongst those programs at the 41st percentile. So it's on the lower end in comparison to the rest of the portfolio. Now, again, that's not, assessing each individual costs in a granular way, but that just gives you a broader portfolio perspective of the benchmarking, if that helps in considering this request.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Much appreciated. Okay, I think we are to the point where we need a motion. Do I hear a motion?
I'm happy to do a motion.
This is Al, I'll second.
All right, I take it that was a motion to approve, but just to say that out loud. Any further discussion by the board? Do we have public comment?
I don't see any hands raised.
Okay, excellent. So Maria, could you call the roll?
Sure. Dan Bernal.
Aye.
Anne-Marie Delage.
Yes.
Isabel Dudon.
Yes.
Mark Fisher-Colbury.
Yes.
Elena Flowers.
Yes.
David Higgins.
Yes.
Steve Julesgaard.
Yes.
Dave Martin. Dave, can I see you? Are you here? Okay. Christine Miaskowski. Lauren Miller-Rogan.
Yes.
Adriana Padilla.
Yes.
Joe Panetta.
Yes.
Al Roulette.
Yes.
Oz Stewart.
Yes.
Jonathan Thomas.
Yes.
Art Torres.
Aye.
Carol Watson.
Yes.
Dan Winiker. Thank you, and the motion carries.
Excellent. So thanks, everybody. I thought that was a great way to start to have a thorough discussion about all the different aspects that we're going to be considering here. So I'm in conflict on the next application, so we'll pass the gavel, so to speak, over to JT, and I will sign off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oz. That was a great discussion, both on the inclusion DEI elements as well as the questions on the budget for that award. And I think both highly topical and very helpful. So thank you, everybody, for your input across the board. So we're on to our second and final application. We will start with a presentation by Gil.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Oh, there it goes. So the next application is 12149. This is an antibody, monoclonal antibody targeting leukocyte immunoglobulin-like receptor B4. And the indication is acute myeloid leukemia with monocytic differentiation and chronic myelomonocytic leukemia, or CMML. And the goal of this application is to complete a phase 1 trial. The funds requested is $6 million. The applicant is providing approximately $3 million in co-funding for this application. A little bit about AML. There's about 20,000 new cases of AML that are diagnosed each year in the US, with a 5-year survival rate of about 29%. Chronic myelomonocytic leukemia has an incidence of about 4 per million people, but about 15 to 30% of those cases will advance to AML. The proposed therapy targets this subset of AML, which represents about 30% of AML, and some therapeutic options are not effective in this subpopulation of patients, and the proposed therapy offers a new and potentially effective option in these patients. Why is this a stem cell project? The proposed therapeutic candidate targets cancer stem cells as the primary mechanism of action. So in terms of related CIRM portfolio projects, we support several projects that broadly impact leukemias and lymphomas. However, at least currently active, we don't have any in the portfolio. We have had 2 previous trials that were related to AML that we supported, but none that specifically target myelomonocytic or monocytic AML. And this particular applicant does not have previous CIRM funding. The grants working group recommendation for this application is a score of 1, meaning it has exceptional merit. There were 11 members that scored this a 1. There was 1 member that scored this a 2, and no members that scored this a 3. The DEI score in this case is a 10. The CIRM team recommendation is to fund this application in concurrence with the GWG recommendation for an award amount of $6 million. JT.
Thank you, Gil. Do we have a motion to approve?
So moved. This is David in San Diego.
Thank you, David. Is there a second?
Second, Isabel.
Thank you, Isabel. Questions or comments by members of the board?
This is David in San Diego. I just wanted to, as a reviewer for the DEI aspect of this grant, I don't have a lot of experience reviewing this kind of thing, but based with that caveat, I was incredibly impressed with how creative and how many different ways they came to the same goal of promoting diversity. Very, very impressed.
Thank you, David. Other questions or comments by members of the board?
Isabel here. Simply back to David. I'd certainly love to hear more. Perhaps we can take an occasion to talk about what looks creative versus what is not, and things we can recommend as best practice kinds of programs and projects.
I would love to do that. I need that kind of education training. I would love to do that.
Thank you.
Other comments?
This is Al. To Isabel's point, we made some recommendations, or I made some recommendations to staff regarding what criteria they might want to consider and how they might want to advise future applications, and in what context they might want to convene reviewers to have discussions in order to advance process improvement. So we are certainly thinking the same way, Isabel.
That's great, Al. Thanks.
Thank you all. Other comments by members of the board? Are there comments from members of the public?
There are none.
Hearing none. Maria, will you please call the roll?
Yes. Dan Bernal.
Aye.
Anne-Marie Dulage.
Yes.
Isabel Dudon.
Yes.
Mark Fisher Colbury.
Yes.
David Higgins.
Yes.
Steve Julesgaard.
Yes.
Dave Martin.
Yes, and I also tried to vote yes on the previous one just for completion.
Thank you.
But it just, unstable IT.
No problem. Thank you so much for clarifying that. Lauren Miller-Rogan.
Yes.
Adriana Padilla.
Yes.
Joe Panetta.
Yes.
Al Rolette.
Yes.
Jonathan Thomas.
Yes.
Carol Watson.
Yes.
Thank you. And Diane Winokur. Thank you so much. That motion carries.
Okay, thank you, Maria. That concludes the action items. We're now down to public comment on any topic anybody would like to discuss. Do we have any such public comment?
No.
Okay. In that case, Maria, could you just remind everybody when the next meeting of the ICOC will be?
Sure, we have a May meeting, so thanks to everyone who responded and is allowing us to have a meeting by attending. We have quorum for May 17th from 12 to 3. There will be action items for the full board to consider. That should probably take about an hour to an hour and a half at most. And then the rest of the time will be for the Application Review Subcommittee to consider translation project applications. So thank you.
Maria, did I miss a vote because I was muted?
No.
Okay.
Thank you. You're all good. Thanks, Art.
Okay, well, I think that concludes things until May 17th. Everybody have a wonderful spring, and we will see you